Hi guys, Russell here. I was explaining to some friends how I felt that the US trade imbalance was really created by American policies and the sort of export-led growth model that we're seeing, particularly out of East Asia, is really in reaction to US policies, which is probably why they feel so aggrieved that Trump blames them for it. So I'm going to talk through why that is, what it means, and what I think it's going to mean for asset markets going forward. So first thing you got to remember is the trade deficit is a very modern phenomenon. It's actually impossible under a gold standard to run a trade deficit for a prolonged period of time. You still have to pay away gold if you want to import more than you export, which is basically what happened in the 50s and 60s. The US started to bleed gold out to Europe, and that's when they left the gold standard. So we don't like the system, we want something else. And they moved to the sort of fiat-based system, which has allowed these big trade deficits to stay, because they basically can print unlimited number of assets to fund their consumption. Now, I think what I'm going to do is use the example of Korea. I like Korea. It's not Japan or China, so there's no sort of threat to the US implicit in that. Everyone likes Korea. And I think it will explain to you why you see such large trade deficits and trade surpluses in the US and its allies. So if you go back to the early 90s, Korea was booming. It was the Asian Tiger era, and it was running a balanced trade, if you like. So it was importing as much as it's exporting, which is exactly what Trump wants from his trade partners and allies. He wants them to not be stealing jobs from the States. The problem was that even though Korea was running like a balanced budget or trade balance, so balanced trade balance, his trade balance was neutral. It was attracting a lot of capital. It had higher interest rates in the US. It was running a fixed exchange rate at the time. And so it started to become very reliant on foreign capital for growth. So what I've done here is BIS data on foreign claims and liabilities in Korea, and you've got like a net number here. So when that number is going up, that means foreigners are putting more money into Korea. And so what you can see is boom times in Korea in the 90s led to huge inflows, and then suddenly when they worried that they won't be able to get their money back or the exchange rate was going to devalue, the money left again. And then this created a financial crisis in Korea. And we can see that again in the sort of 04, 05, 06 period, we had another surge in assets into Korea, which then again left during the GFC. And so this is the Korean won. And what you can see is there was a 97 Asian financial crisis. Korean won got devastated. And likewise in the GFC, it got devastated. I know it's been weak again lately, but I think this is more a response to yen weakness. I'll talk about that later. But these two periods when the won was very weak was a period of weak growth, high unemployment, huge political problems in Korea. And so what governments saw from this was that if you were reliant on capital, outside capital, so if you had an open capital account, you needed to run a large trade surplus to protect yourselves from the sort of fickleness of capital flows, if that makes sense. So if you wanted to, make sure your currency stays stable, or be able to control lending conditions in your country, you needed to run a trade surplus, right? This is what the sort of nature of the system was. And the US was very insistent on opening up capital accounts for investing and for its corporates to invest into nations. And so the experience of Korea and actually most of Asia and most of Latin America, most of Eastern Europe, was that you needed to run a trade surplus to be able to protect yourselves from the fickleness of capital markets. And this fear of capital flows was what really drove the growth of foreign exchange reserves. So Japan was the first nation to really grow foreign exchange reserves outside of gold. They were big buyers of treasury. In fact, they only own treasuries. They own almost no gold. And in the first stage, they were buying treasuries to try and slow down the appreciation of the yen. And then that's continued to happen. So when Japan ran trade surpluses, they continued to accumulate foreign reserves to try and keep the yen weak. They were trying to, and they're building up financial superpower. And Japan was the sort of model here. of using treasuries to try as a sort of macroeconomic tool, the purchase of treasuries, if that makes sense. And what Japan led, the rest of the world copied in dramatic style, so much so that we now have sort of 12 trillion of reserve assets, non-gold reserve assets globally. And the way you need to think about this, I think when people start talking about foreign exchange rates and foreign exchange reserves and capital account balances and current account balance, all this stuff, they sort of switch off. I don't want you to do that. What you should think about is when a country runs builds up foreign exchange reserves, they are saving money. They're sort of saying, do you know what? We had some bad times before. That could have come back. Let's just keep some money with us in the savings just in case we need it. That's exactly what it is. Foreign exchange reserves, the government going, we want to keep some savings. And the only way to generate those savings is if they export more than they import. And so the fickleness of US capital markets and the US insistence on open capital accounts is what really drove the growth in people exporting. They're trying to make some money, save some money. And so what that means, if you're running a large sort of trade surplus, you are really also a lender to the world in many ways. That was the role that Japan played. I think now it's almost the role that China is playing. When you run large trade surpluses, that capital goes back into the world and you become that lender. And that's where China is at the moment. They are lending to the rest of the world. And they are the ones, I think, the swing factor in interest rates and capital markets, in my view. Now, what we've seen, and I think Abe was very, very good at this, but I think what we've seen is that Japan has realized that the sort of trade-led model it's had for a long time is dead and has resorted to stimulus. Now, look, the weak yen is the most obvious example of this sort of stimulus sign, but we've also seen government has been very fiscally loose. And when I was in Japan in May, it absolutely felt like boom times, the most boomiest times I'd seen probably since when I was there in '91, which was top of the bubble economy. Absolute boom times. But what's really interesting is even though the yen has been weak, we have not seen a build in Japanese foreign reserves. If anything, we see foreign reserves being Japan's selling its foreign reserves as it's trying to be more stimulatory. It's trying to stimulate the economy, which is exactly what I would expect. So if you build up savings because of bad times, you then run down these foreign exchange reserves when you're trying to get good times, when you go back and rely on those savings. And I think that's what's happened. Japan has decided it needs to become more stimulatory because actually trade-led growth to the US is no longer politically viable. That makes total sense to me. And in the same sort of period, what we've started to see is gold has inflected higher against treasuries. This is a super long-term graph, which I love. I've used it many times. And what we can see is an inflection from 2000, again, from sort of 2010, as we move into a different period, I think, a different era, where the free trade is dying and government's going to rely on stimulus. And so this pool of capital that's been seen in the world built up in foreign exchange reserves, I think is going to start declining. Now, what is holding us up is I think China refuses to stimulate. I know that they did it after the GFC and they did it again in 2015, 2016. I think Xi in particular felt this was like a bad policy. A lot of bad people made a lot of money and he didn't like it. So he's now moved to, trying to be less stimulatory, I think. And because of this, what we're seeing is Chinese trade numbers are surging, so it's exporting more than imports. But that is actually what is keeping the whole program together. You got all this financing coming in for countries that want to borrow, like the US, potentially like Japan. And I can't help but notice that like the US economy, US asset price has done really well as Chinese bond yields have collapsed. This sort of makes sense to me. China's going, we've got all this excess capital. Who wants it? US is putting up his hand saying, yep, we'll have it, thanks, and taking it and using it. And so what we're also starting to see is US 30-year bond yields, I think, are moving higher. I think they're going to go to 5 or even higher because we are moving to a world where slowly capital is not accumulating in the same way it used to be. And certainly you can easily see that if Trump pushes through his tariff policies and really pushes China in particular to run a stimulatory policy where rather than saving this money that they're earning, but use it back in the domestic economy to get stimulus going, then we could see that inflation goes very much higher. And as I sort of, what I was trying to point out with Korea is that at the moment we have the US as a big borrower and the rest of the world is a lender, more or less. If the people who are lending stop lending or even become borrowers themselves, where does the money come from? And that is the big question. At the moment, I think it's imbalanced, mainly because of China. But if China goes to stimulate, then we are imbalanced. And it's the owners of capital that will do well. And what that really means is that interest rates go much higher. People who are able to lend when everyone wants to borrow are the ones that do best. And that's where I think we are headed. Because if I was a Chinese policymaker, I'd be looking at what Trump wants to do and realize stimulus is almost inevitable. And I think that's coming. And that's when inflation and bond yields go much higher. Hope that makes sense. Stay safe. We'll talk again soon. Ciao.